chapter 6, verse 39, and it says, he commanded them to make them all sit down in groups on the green grass. So Jesus is commanding them, right? Same verbiage. He broke bread, he gave them thanks, and he gave it to his disciples. So Jesus is having a Last Supper with the multitude as a prophetic foreshadowing of the Last Supper with his disciples. Never judge your problems in light of your resources. He can do a lot with a little. Matthew 6:33 says, seek first the kingdom of God above all else and live righteously, and he will give you everything you need. He will take what little you have and he will multiply it into abundance. Verse 7 says, they also had a few small fish, and having blessed them, he said to set them also before them. So they ate and were filled, and they took up 7 large baskets of leftover fragments. Now those who had eaten were about 4,000, and he sent them away, immediately got into the boat with his disciples, and came to the region of Dalmanutha. So another point I want you to recognize in this is put yourself in a position for God to do something big. The disciples were in the wilderness with nothing. They had to trust in Jesus to give them what little they had and watch Jesus do something big with it. Ephesians 3:20 verse 21 says, now to him who is able to do exceedingly abundantly above all that we ask or think, according to the power that works in us, to him be the glory. If we accept God's invitation to participate, we get to be part of that miraculous glory. He doesn't need our help. He didn't need the disciples' help, but he wanted to co-labor with them. He wanted to be in partnership and relationship with them. He wanted to use them as vessels for his miraculous. He wanted them to be a witness for who he was. And he was also teaching them. He was teaching them and building them up. There were reasons why he had 2 different events recorded in the Bible of this very similar multiplying the bread and the loaves. So a couple other things I want to point out to you is that barley loaves were the loaves that were being used. Barley is the first grain to be harvested in the spring. The Feast of Unleavened Bread celebrates the first fruits of the barley harvest. Jesus performs this miracle as Passover is approaching, and later he explains himself as the bread of life in John 6. So we're going to read a few verses to you out of John 6 that coincide with what he was doing here. Verse 27 says, do not labor for the food which perishes, but for the food which endures to everlasting life, which the Son of Man will give you, because God the Father has set his seal on him. Jumping down to verse 32 says, most assuredly I say to you, Moses did not give you the bread from heaven, but my Father gives you true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is he who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. And down in verse 48 says, I am the bread of life. Your fathers ate the manna in the wilderness and are dead. This is the bread which comes down from heaven, that one may eat of it and not die. I am the living bread which came down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever. And the bread that I shall give is my flesh, which I shall give for the life of the world. So a few other things to point out to you between the Mark chapter 6 event and the Mark chapter 8 event. Mark chapter 6 started out with 5 loaves. And if you're into the biblical numbers, you'll know that 5 is a number of grace. And 5 also represented the Torah, which was the Mosaic law. Jesus was doing something new. He said, I did not come to abolish the law, but I came to fulfill it. He was taking the number of 5 was a transference into 12 baskets, right? The 12 baskets that were left over represented each one of the disciples. The disciples were working with Jesus. They were co-laboring with Jesus. The Lord likes to give us good gifts when we are co-laboring with him. There were 12 small baskets, remnants. The word fragment also means remnant. It reminds me of the remnant people that are still hungry for Jesus, the remnant of people that are still left over. We are God's remnant that are still seeking him, still seeking his heart. So there were 12 small baskets left over in the feeding of the 5,000. When you look at the feeding of the 4,000, they started with 7. 7 is God's number of completion, right? When he created the world, he rested on the 7th day, and it was complete. It's his number of completion. And at the end, he had 7 baskets left over. But if you look at the difference in the word basket in the first episode versus the second episode, they're actually different words. The first account of leftover baskets is a small basket. They were individual baskets. They were specifically for those 12 baskets for those 12 disciples. They were individual, small, like lunch-size baskets. But in Mark chapter 8, and it says that they were 7 large baskets, it meant like hamper size, like giant baskets were left over. Because God will always do exceedingly abundantly even more. And God's complete work will always bring an abundance. And so that's what those baskets were. There was a difference in those baskets. Okay, sorry, I'm missing one page in my notes. I think I rearranged them. And why were there 2 accounts? Why was it so important to put the feeding of the 5,000 in all of the Gospels, and the feeding of the 4,000 was only in Mark and Matthew? The first account, the feeding of the 5,000, was actually for the Jews. The multitude of people that were surrounding Jesus in that time were mostly Jews. The feeding of the 4,000 were for the Gentiles. It was for us. The multitude of people when he fed the 4,000 were Gentiles. So the Lord was having a Last Supper with his people, the Jews, his first people, because Jesus was sent first to the Jews and then to the Gentiles. Jesus was sent first to his people. And he had a Last Supper with a multitude of his people. And then he had a Last Supper with a multitude of the Gentiles. And both of those were prophetic imagery of his final supper with his closest people, his disciples that he was doing life with. And when Jesus says in the Last Supper, "Do this in remembrance of me," he actually can say that because he had the Last Supper with the Gentiles. He had Last Supper with us. And so he wants us to remember that, to remember his sacrifice and remember what he did and remember the Last Supper that he actually had with a multitude, thousands of Gentiles in that region. So if we jump on to verse 11, where it says the Pharisees seek a sign, it says, "Then the Pharisees came out and began to dispute with him, seeking from him a sign from heaven and testing him." Verse 12, but he sighed deeply. Anyone here last week when we were talking about sighing deeply? Here it is again. He sighed deeply in his spirit and said, why does this generation seek a sign? Assuredly, I say to you, no sign shall be given to this generation. He had already done so many miracles and signs, but they couldn't see it. They did not have the spiritual understanding to see what he had done. I'm going to flip to Matthew chapter 12, verse 38. This is another account of the Pharisees seeking a sign. It says, then some of the scribes and Pharisees answered, saying, Teacher, we want to see a sign from you. But he answered and said to them, an evil and adulterous generation seeks after a sign, and no sign will be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. Then men of Nineveh will rise up in the judgment with this generation and condemn it, because they repented at the preaching of Jonah. And indeed, a greater than Jonah is now here. Verse 13, and he left them, and getting into the boat again, departed to the other side. Now the disciples had forgotten to take bread, and they did not have more than 1 loaf with them in the boat. Then he charged them, saying, take heed, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. So, anybody do sourdough? Like, that's a big thing right now, right? Sourdough starter. Harris, you're cooking sourdough? You're making sourdough? I just have this picture of the sourdough starter, right? Because as you feed it, it grows, and you don't need very much. You just need a little bit. And the leaven is sour. It's fermented. It permeates. It means mental and moral corruption. And in even little small quantities, it invades everything that it touches. Verse 16, and they reasoned among themselves, saying, it is because we have no bread. But Jesus, being aware of it, now I feel in this part they should put in another Jesus sighs deeply, because he's like, oh my goodness, I just fed 5,000 people, and I showed you what the bread meant, and I just fed 4,000 people. Here we are again, and you're thinking that you don't have enough. It's like, sigh deeply. Why do you reason because you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive nor understand? Is your heart still hardened? Having eyes, do you not see? And having ears, do you not hear? And do you not remember? When I broke the 5 loaves for the 4,000, how many baskets full of fragments did you take up? They said to him, 12. Also, when I broke the 7 for the 4,000, how many large baskets of fragments did you take up? And they said, 7. So he said to them, how is it you still do not understand? They were still spiritually blind. Their spiritual senses were still not formed yet. They did not understand what he was trying to tell them, even though he was asking them questions, pointed questions, pointing things out, reminding them. He performed the same miracle 2 times to really teach them so that they could grasp it. Verse 22, then he came to Bethsaida, and they brought a blind man to him and begged him to touch him. So he took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the town. And when he had spit on his eyes and put his hands on him, he asked if he saw anything. The man looked up and said, I see men like trees walking. Then he put his hands on his eyes again and made him look up. And he was restored and saw everyone clearly. Then he sent him away to his house, saying, neither go into the town nor tell anyone in the town. So he took the man out of that town because Jesus had already been in Bethsaida and had cursed the town. He had cursed the town because people were not believing in him. People didn't recognize who he was, and he had already cursed the town. So he took the blind man by the hand and led him out of town. And it reminds me of, again, the leaven. He didn't want that man corrupted by the negativity in that town. He didn't want that man corrupted by unbelief in that town. So he led the man away from the leaven in that town, away from the unbelief in that town, away from the corruption in that town in order to perform the miracle. You have to be careful who's speaking into your life. What are they speaking to you? Are they speaking negativity to you? Are they fermenting? Are they souring your thoughts? Are they souring your hearts? What's being spoken into your life? What's being spoken even around you? We have to guard our ears and guard our eyes against things from the enemy. Anything that's not of Jesus, we have to protect ourselves in that. Especially if you're going through healing and deliverance and you know you've gotten healing and deliverance. There's so many times I've seen people get delivered from things and then they go back in the world and the little whispers of the enemy. That didn't really happen. That didn't really happen. You're not really healed. You didn't get healing. You didn't get delivered. You still have that problem. We have to be very careful about who we're surrounding ourselves with, who we're allowing to speak into our lives. The man looked up in verse 24, the man looked up and said, I see men like trees walking. Now, I did a lot of digging because to me, that's really highlighted. I feel like that's super important. And I was like, Lord, what does that mean? He saw men like trees walking. And so I put myself in his shoes and I thought, what would that look like if I was seeing fuzzy images and I saw these things that looked like men, but they were as tall as trees. And this is a little bit of just conjecture, but it was kind of how I was feeling at the moment. It reminded me of Nephilim. How big and tall the Nephilim were. They had extra long fingers. They had extra long appendages. And I thought, in order for somebody to see a Nephilim, they would have to start having spiritual eyes. They would have to start getting some spiritual discernment if they were seeing in the spiritual, right? They were not seeing things in the natural. You're seeing things in the spiritual. That's where he would have seen Nephilim. So Jesus put his hands on his eyes again and made him look up. Fix your eyes on heaven. So the man was going through a process of growth in spiritual discernment, in spiritual wisdom. The man was gaining wisdom in his spiritual eyes. And the Lord encouraged him in that and said, look up, look to heaven. And he was restored and saw everyone clearly. He then had spiritual discernment. He had spiritual knowledge, spiritual wisdom, spiritual revelation from that healing from Jesus. Then he sent him away to his house, saying, neither go into the town nor tell anyone in the town. Verse 27, now Jesus and his disciples went out to the towns of Caesarea Philippi, and on the road he asked his disciples, saying to them, who do men say that I am? So they answered, John the Baptist, but some say Elijah, and others one of the prophets. He said to them, but who do you say that I am? Peter answered and said to him, you are the Christ. Then he strictly warned them that they should tell no one about him. I'm going to jump back just real quickly. I forgot one of my notes on spit, so this is important. In Jesus' arguments with the religious leaders, he was continually hinting about who he was. He was saying things that began, I am. I am. He made a lot of I am statements, which was representative of God appearing to Moses in the burning bush and saying, I am who I am. And the religious leaders understood his implications and began accusing him of blasphemy. There was always an argument about Jesus' identity and who other people were saying that he was. The act of Jesus using his spit to heal was another reinforcement of his identity, because at that time, the Talmud, which is religious teachings and traditions of that time, there was a tradition that the spit of the firstborn of a father has healing properties, but not the spit of the firstborn of a mother. So the spit of the firstborn of a father has healing properties. And so Jesus was reinforcing the identity that he was trying to tell the Pharisees of I am who I am by using his spit to heal this person's eyes. And they would have recognized that as a tradition taught in the Talmud. And then you lead into verse 29, where he is now asking his disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" Peter answered him and said to him, "You are the Christ." Then he strictly warned them that they should tell no one about him. And he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things. So now he's switching. So now he's starting to do a new teaching with the disciples. And be rejected by the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed. And after 3 days, rise again. He spoke this word openly. Then Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But when he had turned around and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter, saying, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are not mindful of the things of God, but the things of men." Peter was still speaking from his flesh. He was still trying to develop his spiritual eyes. He was not seeing things from God's perspective. He was seeing them from man's perspective. So it's a common theme in this whole book of, or chapter 8 of Mark, in developing your spiritual eyes and your spiritual ears, seeing things as God sees them and not as man sees them. In verse 34, he says, when he had called the people to himself with his disciples also, he said to them, "Whoever desires to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me." I had always questioned that verse because I had this image of Jesus carrying this really heavy cross, right? And so I thought, well, Lord, if you're telling us to take up our cross in order to follow you, I thought, man, that sounds really heavy. That sounds like a big burden. That doesn't sound like an abundant life that you came to earth and died to give us, this abundant life, if we are constantly walking around with this heavy cross on our back. And so when I dug into the original language of take up your cross and follow me, it actually means to lift off. Throw off the weight of heavy sin, right? That Hebrews teaches us. Throw off the weight of your sin. It means to take off, lift off your sin and your cross in order to follow me. Because Jesus already paid the price for all of it. Jesus bears the weight of the sin on his shoulders so that we don't have to carry the weight of that sin on our shoulders. We're supposed to lay it at the foot of his cross so that he can carry it for us. So that take up your cross and follow me, it is get rid of your sin. It is lift up the weight of guilt and shame and disobedience. Get it off of you. Get it off your shoulders. Set it down at the foot of Jesus and then follow him. For whoever desires to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. For what will profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? Or what will a man give in exchange for his soul? For whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels. Amen. So this is an invitation. God is inviting you to co-labor with him. God is inviting you to give him the small things that you have so that he can multiply it. God is inviting you to use your voice to speak out for truth and to be a part of his miracles. It's an invitation to be part of what he's doing by being obedient and saying, "Here I am." Amen. Well, take 10 minutes and share anything. If you guys have anything that comes up, any revelation, I would love to hear it. In about 10 minutes, we'll go around and just share anything else that comes to you. Thank you.